Title Studio allows the creation of three-dimensional text and objects. By default, these three-dimensional media items exist in a two-dimensional environment. Although you can apply depth to them and move them about in 3D space, they can't interact with each other as they would do in the real world. In this tutorial, I want to show how the environment is converted into a three-dimensional environment where objects can be made to be absorbed by other objects. I'll also be showing how the various camera views can help with the placement of objects in 3D space. I'm using Title Studio within Continuum 2022. Your version's UI may be different. For this tutorial, I'm using the standalone version of Title Studio, and to save time, I've created a title purely for demonstration purposes. It consists of two extruded spline primitives, forming coloured cubes. I've tilted the scene in the X-plane slightly to give a better view. The two cubes are in the same position in the Y and Z plane, but as you can see, separated in the X plane. I've named one cube primary and the other cube secondary, named as such simply because the primary cube occurs above the secondary cube in the track list. Viewers of my earlier episodes will remember that the track structure is hierarchical. This means that any object in the track list will take precedence over objects below it. In practical terms, this means that, with the scene composited in 2D, the primary cube will always look as if it's in front of the secondary cube. You can see that as I move the yellow cube over the green one, it seems to absorb it, until it reaches a certain position when it appears to be in front of the green one. Now, to emphasize this, I'll move the primary cube backwards in the Z plane. The two cubes are still in the same position in the Y plane. In a true three-dimensional environment, if I now move the primary cube to the secondary one, it should pass behind the secondary one. As you can see, it appears to move above the secondary cube rather than behind it. We know this can't be correct because the position of the two cubes in the Y plane hasn't changed. This apparently odd behaviour is simply because the primary cube has dominance over the secondary cube in this two-dimensional environment. I can reinforce this odd behaviour by swapping over the positions of the primary and secondary cubes in the track list. Nothing has changed except the relative positions of the cube in the track list. I'll now select the primary cube and move it to the secondary one to see what happens. Now it does what you would expect it to do. It goes behind the secondary cube, but only because the secondary cube has now become the dominant entry. To change the environment so that interactions occur as they would do in the real world, the scene entry needs changing. I mentioned how to do this in episode 9, but I'll explain again. If you right-click on the scene entry, you'll see two options. Select the option labelled Switch to 3D Render. Now I'm going to select the primary cube, which is now back in the primary position in the track list. If I move it again towards the secondary cube, you can see that it does move behind the secondary cube, despite being the dominant track entry. I can swap the entries around in the track list and it won't make any difference. The two objects now behave as they would do in 3D space. The various camera views provide assistance in the placing of objects in three-dimensional space. These camera views are accessed by selecting the Toggle Camera Views icon at the top of the Composite window. There are 8 views available, with the Render Camera view being the default. Each view will give a different perspective of the selected scene. The last option, World View, is probably the most useful. With this view, you can easily see where each object is in relation to other objects, and you can use the normal methods of moving and resizing objects. You can clearly see the X and Z plane axes. You will also see the outline for the composite window. The lines emanating from the corners of the composite window outline converge to the point of view camera. This camera and its parameters can be revealed by selecting the Camera tab for the scene entry. I hope to dedicate a future tutorial to the use of the camera view options. By the way, if you're wondering why some of the views showed black images, it's due to where the default scene light is placed. I can show this by selecting the scene entry, then the Lights tab. The scene light is placed at a distance of 768 from the scene, so the rear of the cubes aren't illuminated. If I decrease the distance to a negative value, the rear of the cubes will be illuminated. Of course, now I've moved the light behind the cubes, their fronts are now in shadow. To supplement the camera views, you can use the Split Views option. This is accessed by selecting the Toggle Split Views icon. I'll not go through these options as they're fairly self-explanatory, and to be honest, if you don't possess a second monitor that's compatible with Title Studio, some of the views can be quite, shall we say, busy, if that makes sense. You'll see when you try them out. For me, the most useful view is the dual horizontal. This can show the render camera and world views side by side. You can use these combined views to assist you in placing and moving your objects. You've already seen one practical example, and that's the spinning logo at the start of my tutorials. This was created using extruded spline and text media and contained within a 3D render scene. Another example would be the emergence of extruded text from a solid body. You will use keyframe animation to control the movement of the text object in the Y-plane. One more example is embossed lettering on a solid object. You can certainly create an embossed look in a default 2D scene, but if you wanted to rotate the embossed object with the text, it wouldn't look right. I'll load in a project that shows this. As you can see, the embossed effect looks as it should. However, if you rotate the two fully, you'll see that at some point it begins to look wrong. Now, if I convert the scene entry to a 3D rendered scene, and rotate the two again, you'll see that now it looks as it should. Here's another cool thing you can do to create 3D objects. I'll start with a clean sheet, create a circular spline object and turn off fill. I'll now create another circular object, but this will be smaller than the first. You'll notice that the two spline entries are encompassed in the one spline shape entry. The smaller circle will now be placed centrally in the larger circle. To do this, select the arrow tool and hover the mouse over the small circle's periphery. Remember that you can only move the circle when the periphery turns yellow. Now the two splines are in position, I need to select them both. You do this by first selecting the texture track, then with the arrow tool selected, click one of them, hold Shift down and click on the other. Don't forget the splines need to turn from red to yellow for them both to be selected. I warn you, this can be a little tricky and you may get frustrated. The two splines should each have a bounding box. Now click on Tools on the command bar and select Path, then Combine Contours. If the Combine Contours option is greyed out, something hasn't been done right. I did warn you that it could be tricky. You need to try again. The two splines will now be combined into one, as you will see in the track structure. An important point to note, you can't select the splines by shift-clicking the spline object entries in the track structure. If you do, the Combine Contours option won't be available in the tool options. Now I need to change the spline object into an extrusion. You do this by clicking on the Change Track Shape icon on the shape entry, in this case the entry marked Spline Track, then selecting Extrusion. You'll find that the spline will disappear. This is because we turned off fill earlier. To correct this, select the spline object entry, click on the Fill tab and put a check mark in the Fill On box. Now select the Shape Track entry, then the Extrusion tab. Enter 20 in the Extrusion Parameter Value box. Now click the Shape Position tab and enter 60 in the Spin Y parameter. You can see the extrusion is now a hollow cylinder. Here's one I created using the same method. You'll notice that as I spin the object, it doesn't spin around its centre. This is as a result of the way I created it. If I select the spline object track, you'll see the position of the two splines when I created them. They are offset from the centre of the composite window. With the Spline Track entry selected and the Shape Position tab selected, there are 4 parameters that determine how an object rotates. By default, these 4 parameters are set such that the rotation point is at the centre of the display. That means that, by default, any shape created, irrespective of where it is placed on the composite display, will rotate around the centre of the display. It's relatively easy to correct though. With the shape entry selected, select the rotation pivot drop-down and select Independent. You'll see that the pivot X, Y and Z parameters now are values. You can use these values to maneuver the rotation pivot point to where you want. To make it easier, set the 3 rotation parameters to their default. Now, if I rotate the object, it rotates around its centre. Here's another example. This one's inspired by one of New Blue's tutorials. In the tutorial, a Starfleet command insignia in the form of an EPS file was used. I haven't the software to create EPS files, so I decided to have a go with spline objects, using the method I described earlier. It's not perfect, but it only took about 15 minutes to complete. That's a brief introduction to working in a three-dimensional environment. Most of the time, titles and lower thirds can be successfully created in the default two-dimensional environment, but there are times when a 3D environment is desirable. This is especially true when working with multiple animated 3D objects. As always, thanks for watching, and if you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so. Join me for my next tutorial in this series on Title Studio. Until then, bye for now.